Welcome, welcome, everyone. Glad to have you here for this Friday series of May and a little bit into June. Um, so, whether you're a team lead, a business owner, a seasoned HR leader, you're here because of the topic trust and transparency, because you know that those aren't just buzzwords. They're actually fundamental for the way that we lead and how we collaborate. And that's not merely an opinion, that's actual fact. There's a study done by Gallup of over 10,000 people. And one of the questions had to do with the trust that people have in their leaders. And when people were found to trust their leadership, 1 in 2 employees were engaged. But when people didn't find their leaders trustworthy, it dropped to a whopping 1 in 12 were engaged. So that's a big difference that is driven simply by trust in leadership, right? Is leadership, um, do they have my back? Are they being honest? Can I believe what they say? Do they have best intentions in mind? It has a direct correlation to how engaged employees are in work. And that engagement then translates to morale, translates to retention. So it's a ripple effect, and it's significant difference when trust does or doesn't exist. So jumping into leading with trust and transparency, we're going to explore a few common pitfalls that I see, um, not only just in the realm of articles and information that's readily available, but also in the work that I do as a leadership consultant, right? What are some common pitfalls? What are some strategies that are not only effective, but also relatively easy to put into action? Um, and if this resonates with you, please feel free to add some comments in the chat. Tell me what your experience has been when you've been in an organization when there is trust, or even if you've been in an organization where there's been lack of trust. How has that impacted your experience in those organizations? This trust and transparency in the workplace can't be optional, because when there's not trust, people are not going to be fully open. They're not going to tell you the whole truth. They're going to watch their words. There's going to be miscommunication and misinterpretation and misalignment. And all of that leads to frustration and bubbles up into bigger problems. Without having trust in a team, every conversation feels almost like a performance, right? People are watching their words, they're hesitant to speak up. And instead of spending energy collaborating and communicating and being productive, there's more effort in sort of coming up with what are the right words? What am I going to share? What am I not going to share? And it's really, it's a waste of energy, right? But that's what, you know, that's the result of when people don't feel safe, when there isn't that trust and transparency. And when I say transparency, I'm not only talking about, okay, let's keep people in the loop of what it is that we're doing. Part of that transparency also is making sure that people understand the why behind things, because when leaders aren't clear about that, it winds up creating confusion. People may not prioritize the most important things, and not because they're intentionally trying to make things more difficult, but because they might literally not understand the bigger picture. So, to that end, a few of the missteps or common pitfalls, if you will, that I see with my clients in terms of leadership mistakes is avoiding difficult conversations. Because when you're leading people, rather, hard conversations come with the territory. right? Things are not always going to be unicorns and rainbows and butterflies. There's going to be difficult things that come up. There's going to be decisions that have to be made and they have to be communicated. But that doesn't mean that we have to be disrespectful. It doesn't mean we have to be unkind. It doesn't mean we have to be demoralizing. It could definitely mean that we're going to have some uncomfortable moments, may not be super fun, but if we avoid those direct and difficult conversations, we might feel a little bit better in the moment, but in the long run, it is not going to create a solution. It's going to make the problem worse in the long run. Another one I see often is inconsistent messaging. So what you say and what you do don't match up. And once or twice, like, it's easy for people to give grace. It's easy for people to forgive, right? Like, oh, that's out of character, something must have happened. But if you're time after time making commitments that you don't keep, even in seemingly unimportant things, it still sends a message, right? Is she says this, but she doesn't follow through. So I can't trust her word. Whether those are little things or big things, the experience is then I can't ever trust what you say, because if you're not reliable in the little things, why would I rely on you for the big things? And then another one is lack of being vulnerable, lack of being transparent, right? One example that comes to mind is, and you can probably all relate because we usually have at least one of those friends that is living their perfect life online, right? Always posting the highlight reel, eating at the best restaurants, traveling to all these beautiful places. But how much do you actually buy that they are really living this picture perfect life, right? Because spoiler alert, they're not. They just choose to show you what they want you to see, right? And that same concept applies with leaders. When they don't show vulnerability, they're not relatable. They can come off as disingenuous, and that doesn't elicit openness from anyone else, right? If this person is going to be open with me, then I'm not going to be open with them, right? They'll show you that same lack of vulnerability. And to be clear, when I say transparency also doesn't mean over. We don't need to know all your personal problems. We don't need to know all your personal insecurities. We don't need to know details beyond what is appropriate to share. It just means being clear and being consistent and giving relevant information. That's what transparency ultimately means. So then what can we do to build trust? Flip it on its head, right? So essentially all of the pitfalls that we just talked about, we're doing the opposite. So create a safe space, right? If you've heard the term psychological safety, it's that feeling of people feeling safe to express their ideas without fear of backlash, without fear of judgment, without fear of retaliation or rebuttal or an explanation of why you're wrong. It's just pause, listen, ask sincere questions. Make it feel like it's a safe space for people to share their ideas, right? So as an example, I have a preteen and a teenager at home. If I were to clutch my pearls every time they share something that they've said or done, that's going to be the end of it, right? They're not going to come back and be open and honest with me, right? I even question sometimes how open and honest they are right now, right? But there is some level of communication, right? Because they feel safe that they can share with me, and it's not going to be a big to do and fiasco, right? They're just little people, and big people or adults are the same way, right? We all want to feel safe. We don't want to have every comment that we make be dissected and judged and refuted. So make that space safe. Just listen, ask questions. Clear and honest communication. So be mindful with your words, be intentional with your words, right? So you're not being disrespectful, you're not being demoralizing, but you can be direct even when you're delivering difficult news. Because it doesn't help anyone to be vague or to leave things into interpretation when it's difficult news, right? We want to be very clear, very direct. We want everyone to be on the same page because that ambiguity is not going to help anyone. And then model that behavior, right? Lead with vulnerability, acknowledge your mistakes, ask questions, seek input, because it's more than okay to share that you're human. It's actually necessary for you to be able to build that trust, right? If people don't feel like you're being completely open and you're not showing that vulnerability, then they're not going to show it with you either, right? So model that behavior, because as leaders, our actions carry double the weight of anyone else. So it doesn't actually matter as much what you say as what you do. If you lead with vulnerability, if you lead with transparency, if you lead with openness, then people are more likely to follow suit and to have that trust in you. I'm going to share a personal experience of an old job that I had, because to be quite honest, some of the best lessons that I've learned in terms of leadership haven't come from the best leaders I've had. They've actually come from the worst leaders I've had, right? It was like, that's exactly what I do not want to do. And this experience I'm going to share with you is one of those, right? Is I once worked for a company that at the executive level was making decisions that were not great. They were illogical, counterproductive, like really dumb, right? I knew it, my team knew it, my boss knew it, but at the same time, it was out of our hands. The decision had already been made, and including from my manager, right? Like they did not have a say in it. And from my perspective, that turned into a pivotal moment for him to show up as a real leader, right? Like, okay, how are you going to deal with this? And unfortunately, he chose the path of what I call um, polishing a turd and calling it a diamond, right? Putting a spin on something and trying to sell it to us as if it was a good thing, all while knowing, like we knew, and he knew that it was not a great idea, but he came in trying to sell it as a good idea, as if he was going to make fools of us, right? Um, and the result was trust eroded like fast. The team became dysfunctional, people started leaving, and the people that did stay were not in a great headspace. We were definitely in a way worse position than before. Had he chosen a slightly different path, right? Of, okay, this isn't great, but we've already communicated what our thoughts were and why we know it's not going to work, but we're still being asked to move forward. That messaging would have kept the respect of the team, kept the trust of the team, and the odds are probably not as many people would have left. And ultimately, the dust would have settled, and we would have still had a strong team intact, tackling things together, right? The outcome in a business sense would have still been probably pretty similar because we would have followed through with some of those mandates. But the team itself at its core in terms of morale and trust would have been much different had he chosen a different path of transparency for the team. So like I said, some of the best lessons I've learned are from some of the worst experiences. So 3 takeaways for today. And again, they're not always necessarily easy, but they are relatively simple, right? Is be consistent. Have what you say match what you do. Communicate openly, even when there's tough conversations, right? If you can be clear, be open, um, that is a huge building block for trust. And then model that behavior, model that honesty, that vulnerability, because people trust the leaders who are real, not the leaders who are perfect, right? People are smarter than we give them credit for, right? They may not necessarily always push back. They may not necessarily always make it clear in the moment, but people are smart and they catch on. And if you are withholding important information, if you're being vague, if your actions don't align with your words, people see it and they feel it, and the trust takes a hit. So be consistent, communicate openly, and model that vulnerability. All righty. All right. That is all the time that we have for today. We're trying to keep these sessions pretty brief. But as a reminder, the series will be going on for all of this month and some of next month, various leadership topics. And if you or your organization are looking for leadership development, send me a message, leave me a comment on whatever platform you're watching or listening in on, and we can talk about how it works. Thanks so much. Have a great rest of your day.